Hey there. So my name is Sarah McDugal, and I am an author, speaker, trainer for faith community organizations, and an abuse recovery coach for those who are getting out of abusive relationships in the faith community. I work specifically with women in the faith community who have experienced toxic relationships, domestic violence, so on and so forth. So it is a privilege and an honor to be here with you today. I appreciate the opportunity to sit together and talk about dating and sexual purity. It's a huge topic, right? It's something that is super multi-layered and multi-level. It's about so much more than just sex. It is not just about bodies. It's about hearts and minds and souls and bodies altogether. So as an abuse recovery coach, I work with a lot of clients who are who've experienced abuse, trauma, childhood trauma, adult trauma, teen trauma, and that definitely affects our relationships. Statistics show that, honestly, that more than 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual assault, and 1 in 6 men. And so that means that the majority of us are dealing with some kind of, not majority, a significant percentage of us, that's what I meant to say, are dealing with some kind of difficult history that impacts our relationships, our sense of purity, our understanding of how to experience and embrace purity in our dating relationships. So in my background, I'm the founder of Wilderness to Wild. We just call it Wild. And we do online coaching and courses, and we do books and ebooks. I've written 7 that are all about helping us as individuals and as a corporate community work together to make church a safe place, safe for those who are dating, safe for those who are not yet old enough to be dating, and safe for those who are building families and raising kids. When we talk about God's design for intimacy, first of all, if we're going to talk about sexual purity, we have to talk about where it starts, right? What is God's design for intimacy? Now, I'm going to talk about some really hard-hitting stuff today in this session. And I'm going to be very blunt because in my line of work, it does no good to beat around the bush, I've found. Also, I work with difficult, challenging, awkward, and uncomfortable topics all day, every day. So maybe I'm immune to it, but there's pretty much nothing that that shocks me anymore. So I'm going to be very, very straightforward and blunt. And I hope that you'll be okay with that. But before we get to the really really awkward or just no holds barred, no punches kind of part, I want to start with addressing a common foundation. See, if we're looking at this subject that is a deeply personal subject, a deeply intense subject that carries a lot of expectations, potentially a lot of baggage, a lot of pain, a lot of hopes, a lot of dreams, a lot of anguish, all of those things. It's a highly volatile kind of subject. So if we're not talking about the same thing from the same place, we might misunderstand each other, right? So I want to lay a foundation. First of all, when I am coming to the topic of dating and sexual purity, I take an approach personally in my study of the Bible, my study of the writings of Ellen White, my study of psychology, science and research. I take a very sex positive approach. I also take a very monogamous, biblical, sex is for marriage only approach. That means I believe that sex is intended by God to be sacred and holy and beautiful. Sex is not dirty. Sex is not something to be avoided for its own sake. Sex is not something to be exploited for the fun of it. Sex is not something we take from other people. Sex is, I believe, based on scripture, it is a gift. It is a beautiful and incredible and wonderful bonding thing that God created to be experienced and given between two people freely, one to the other. Now, and caveat, in the commitment, inside the commitment of marriage. Now, when we look at that in today's world, if you contrast that definition of sexuality and the beauty and the sacredness and the holiness and the gift of sexuality, and you place that in contrast with today's culture, we get some dissonance, right? Not just some dissonance, we get a lot of dissonance. We get a massive amount of incongruous nonconformity, one with the other. These two things, the biblical definition of sex as a sacred and beautiful and holy gift, and the world, the take what you can get, do what feels good, everything that you want, go for it, just be out to get it. These two things don't even belong in the same galaxy. And so, regardless of whether we would like it or not, our concept of sex, dating, marriage, and how sex fits into these things is absolutely impacted by our perception and our conditioning of what sex looks like in our music, in our movies, in our television shows, in our dating history, in our childhood history, in what we observed from our parents, in what we read. All of these things often have shaped our view of sexual purity and what it is supposed to look like in our relationships far more heavily than actually God's word. So I believe that it is important to look at what God says. God created sexuality in the original marriage gift between Adam and Eve. They knew each other. They understood the deeper parts of each other's psyche and being. They were whole and unified in far more than just physical union. It wasn't just an act. It was a knowing of each other. That comes in the mental, emotional, and spiritual safety of commitment and wholeness with each other. Now, one of the important parts of that is actually being able to view the other person as a whole person, mind, soul, body, intellect, character, personality, all of it, rather than just a collection of sexual parts or a boost to your ego or a tool for your physical or societal gratification. Being with another person in a relationship, being with another person sexually in marriage is far more than just enjoying what their body has to offer. Now, our society would like to break it down and say, hey, sex can be just sex and relationships are something else, and you can just do sex over here and not have it impact who you are and who other people are over here. But that's not how God created it. That's not how we were formed as human beings, for men or women. And then there are those who say, well, hey, women have a hard time just having sex indiscriminately, but guys, they can just have sex with whomever. And I don't believe that's true either, because God created men to not, how do I even put this? God created men not incapable of having sanctified sexuality. Now, the world will tell you that you are not in control of your sexuality as a guy. You have needs. You need to get your needs met. You got to do whatever you got to do to get your needs met. And if she isn't meeting your needs, then you have the right, the entitlement to get your needs met elsewhere. God doesn't say that. God says that we have a calling as his followers to be pure, to be holy and sanctified, even in our sexuality, to be respectful and honoring, even in our sexuality. And that's not just something God says to women. That's something God says to men and women. So when we are talking about being pure in dating relationships, it's not just about not exploiting the other person. It's also about not exploiting your own body. So let's back up from that a little bit, because we can talk about that and it can become the same tired old talk that you've heard 100 times if you've been to conferences about relationships before. But I'm going to take a different angle today. I believe sexual purity is absolutely important. But I also believe that we have made an idol out of sexual purity in the faith community. Yeah, I know. That's not what you expected me to say next, is it? No, I am not advocating for promiscuity. I do believe, I've just said it, that sex is created by God for marriage. But I also believe that the modesty and purity culture, as it has been defined in so much of the faith community, where there's so much pressure, especially on women, to not give away their sexuality, and this idea that you are damaged goods somehow if something has happened to you sexually outside of marriage, I believe that that modesty and purity culture is actually just another form of rape culture. You didn't expect me to say that next either, did you? So am I suggesting this as a rubber stamp of approval to be deliberately, sinfully provocative or sexually active in a way that doesn't glorify God? Of course not. What I'm saying is that we often just gloss over the surface of the sexual purity conversation, and we never really dig down into the heart of it in a way that actually reflects what young people go through in today's society. In this world where 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted, 1 in 6 men, it's insane to place a man or a woman's sense of value on their sexual history. That doesn't mean, though, that we should not hold our sexuality sacred and holy before God, whether it is before marriage or during marriage or even after marriage. I don't know, maybe there are some in the audience right now and you're dating again after being widowed or being divorced or experiencing an abusive marriage, and now you are tentatively trying to date again, and you're wondering, where does that leave my sexual purity? If I've already been sexually active or I've already been married, is anything game? Is it all fair game? What do I do to glorify God with my body, my mind, and my soul now? Well, first of all, I want to talk about the barriers to that sense of purity that happen in today's relationships, whether it's dating or marriage. The very first one, the very first barrier to the sense of purity and wholeness and safety in romantic relationships is trauma. It is history of what has happened to you in the past. We are not creatures who live in isolation. Our past, our childhood, our teen years, our young adulthood, all of these play into our identity of who we are and what is happening now. If you have a history of trauma, male or female, if you have any kind of assault, molestation, violence, exposure to pornography from a young age in your history, it's definitely going to impact how you handle and feel about your sexual purity now. It's important, if you have experienced any of these things, to seek out therapy, counseling, healing, and to do the work that is needed for yourself, for your own healing, before you bring that into a relationship with another person. Here's the second one. I'm going to spend a little time on this. One of the biggest, most colossal barriers today to sexual purity in a dating or married relationship is addiction, particularly sexual addiction. That includes viewing pornography. Just to clear it up, in case anyone was murky, the consumption of porn is not sexual purity. Viewing porn is adultery if you're married, fornication if you're not. Porn is voyeurism for sexual gratification with anyone who's not your spouse. It's also, it's abuse. It's abuse on multiple levels. Porn, cybersex, they're all not glorifying to God. Now here's how these are abusive on multiple levels. It is financial abuse to pay someone, not your spouse, to help you abuse your body by cheating on your spouse, cheating on your significant other, or having sex with someone you're not married to, even if you're not married, through a screen or in real life, but that goes without saying. It's emotional and psychological abuse to lead the person you're with or the person you will someday be with to believe that you're keeping your vows or that you're keeping your promise to be faithful to them if you're in a dating relationship, while you're engaging in sexual activity, even if it's one-sided, with others. It's sexual abuse to use your body to participate in sex acts with someone you're not married to, even if you're not in a relationship right now. You're sexually abusing yourself because God created sex to be within marriage. It's spiritual abuse to live a double life sexually while you are leveraging your role as a church leader, a church member, and not seeking help if you are dealing with a sexual addiction. Now, this doesn't even begin to address the dehumanizing connections between pornography and trafficking, human trafficking, the modern day slave trade, but I don't want to blow everything up in just one presentation. I mean, why should I do that, right? So when we are talking about pornography and sexual purity, the two are completely incompatible. And if you are in a dating relationship, this is a conversation that you need to have. Even if you're saying, hey, we're going to stay sexually pure with each other, you need to be having this conversation, because in today's world, a huge number of men and women watch porn and sometimes think nothing of it. Roughly 80% of men in their 20s watch porn regularly, and inside the church, it's no better. Among Christians, 79% of men aged 18 to 30 and 67% of men aged 31 to 49 watch porn regularly. Kids aren't immune either. 90% of children ages 8 to 16 have seen porn online already. So you cannot skate by on assumptions. And something like 30% of women say that they watch porn or struggle with a porn addiction on a regular basis. So it is definitely higher among men, but growing among women. And it contributes to our hyper-sexualized culture in a way that is in no way glorifying to God. So based on today's porn addiction data, you simply just can't assume that the great Christian guy or girl that you're dating doesn't have a sexual addiction that they are working on or that they are turning a blind eye to. So whether or not your idea of sexual addiction is the same as theirs, this is a conversation that you need to be having. So first of all, pornography impacts our mental health. Now, I know that's a big, huge statement, but that's what the science says. Viewing pornography reduces empathy. It reduces the ability to see others as a whole person. and it increases the acceptance of rape culture and aggression. So you want to, as a girl, if you are a female and you're listening to this today, you want to get some baseline for your guy's overall mindset. Does he think it's okay to control others? Porn is all about control. Does he subconsciously see women as objects of sexual release instead of whole persons? Is he likely to make excuses for his own sexual sin instead of seeking accountability for those things so that he can grow in purity? And guys, if sexual purity is high on your priority list, these are questions you need to be asking of any girl that you are interested in. Now, asking these kind of questions is not an automatic guarantee that you're going to get someone and that is definitely committed to sexual purity, or that you've vetted someone completely. It's just one piece of the getting to know each other process. Now, I obviously am coming to this perspective from the angle that you are intending to save sex for marriage and that you are wanting to be sexually pure. I'm assuming that in the foundation of this entire session. But as you move forward in a dating relationship, you need to ask things like, and I have a whole cheat sheet on this on my website at wilderness2wild.com. If you click on the giveaways, you can get my entire porn and dating tough questions cheat sheet. So you want to ask things like, do you think it's different for men to watch porn than for women? Is it okay for one but not the other? Do you believe that it's okay for men to meet their needs with porn, but women shouldn't defile themselves? What do you think? Is it okay to have double standards like that? Is sex a need? Is it a fundamental entitlement that you need to get from anywhere? If so, why would God say that sex outside of marriage is inappropriate? Why would God say that celibacy outside of marriage is what he calls his standard? Did you know that science backs up the Bible on this? Research shows that pornography is directly linked to the sex trafficking industry. One of my friends in the sheriff department trains law enforcement across North America in trafficking response. And he says that if you've watched 30 minutes of porn, you are guaranteed to have been watching at least one person who was performing against their will. At its core, all pornography is exploitative in nature. It exploits the people involved in making it. It creates a chokehold, escalating addiction on the people who become more and more addicted to watching it, and it devastates the family and friends who feel betrayed by the addict's lies and secrets. Porn is profoundly addicting, and it is not something that you're just like, well, I'll just do this while I'm single, but once I get married and I can have sex regularly, then I'll quit. It doesn't work that way. You don't try out cocaine just for a little while thinking you're going to quit when you get a good chef to move into your house and make you great food. The two don't connect that way. Sam Carr writes that, in short, empathy and sexual objectification are incompatible. Because why? Because repeatedly viewing explicit material that reduces the human body to a vessel for exploitative, often violent sexual gratification without consent results in a reduced ability to understand and connect with other humans in real life. It diminishes the viewer's capacity for healthy intimacy. It increases subconscious attitudes of misogyny, which is hatred against women. It views women as objects rather than whole people. And honestly, it is degrading to men, because men, you are better than this. You are created for holier and better things than exploitation. Research shows that porn consumption and the resulting attitude of sexual objectification lead to higher levels of violence and aggression, especially toward women. So is it any wonder that these attitudes of aggression, objectification, and lack of empathy are such a problem in our pornography-obsessed society? But see, porn habits aren't just about the content either. Consuming porn leads to habits of deception and secrecy and betrayal. Most sexual addiction rehabilitation programs focus on diagnosing the issue and changing the behavior. And those are great things, but then they stop there, which leaves an entire aspect of addiction unaddressed. And that is the systemic mindset of violating human rights and abusing other people, of taking sex against consent. And it is inextricably entwined with porn addiction. There's a doctor named Omar Minwalla who does incredible research into sexual addiction. And he says the problem is that sexual acting out disorders are not just sexual behaviors, but are also abusive conduct patterns and complex pathologic systems. They often include elaborate, deceptive, compartmentalized sexual relational realities and systems of abusive covert management. That means these are patterns of methodical planning over time, careful construction of the manipulation of others, and cognitive schemes well maintained in order to keep a compartmentalized reality protected from discovery. It means you live in these closed off boxes instead of living whole and transparent and clean with one face. God says that we are to live with love, joy, peace. He says, whatsoever things are pure and holy and true and of good reputation, think on these things, Philippians 4:8. The fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, Galatians 5. These include being pure in our mind, our heart, and our bodies. It takes pre-planning to sexually act out in many instances, Dr. Omar Minwalla says, sometimes requiring days of strategizing against the integrity of vital relational stability and family infrastructure that is required for health. In fact, maintaining a compartmentalized sexual or relational reality within a family system and a relational, intimate life takes profound energy to orchestrate and maintain, requiring careful and skilled methodology. This is not simply impulsive or compulsive sexual behavior. That means the acceptable amount of porn in a godly, Christ-honoring relationship is 0. Pornography undercuts, it takes sexual purity out at the knees, whether you are single or married. Pornography erodes your ability to see each other as whole, complete people made in the image of God. When we are told that we are created in the image of God, it means that when you look at another human being, you are looking at God's image. How can you be looking at someone sexually acting out on a screen or in real life to whom you are not married, which very often comes along with violence and aggression and exploitation, and be seeing the image of God in that person? You can't. How can we exploit the person we are dating for our own pleasure outside of the bounds of what God has said is sacred and holy, and still look at them and see the image of God, imago Dei, the reflection of God's identity and character and soul in that person while exploiting them? You can't. One of the most incredible things is to stop and realize that each person that you come in contact with is a reflection of the image of God. And there is no excuse for exploitation or abuse of another person when we claim to be united with God and following Him. So we have two areas here that are barriers to sexual purity. We have trauma, we have addiction. We spend a lot of time on addiction. I want to add one third one before we move into what sexual purity looks like in real life. And the third one is abuse within the relationship. Trauma is abuse from history. Addiction is honestly self-abuse and the exploitation or the passive consuming of the exploitation of others. And abuse is another barrier to sexual purity and to a sense of safety and oneness in our romantic relationships. Abuse can come in many forms. It's not just sexual, but abuse can also be psychological, verbal, emotional, financial, social, spiritual, cultural. When people say, now some of those are obvious, but when people say things like, well, this is just how we do it. These are the expectations where I come from. These are the expectations where my family grew up. So yes, these expectations may go against your conscience or may go against what God says, but this is how we do it. So I'm going to go with how we do it instead of what God says. I'm not going to respect your conscience. That's abuse. Did you know that there are 13 forms of abuse that are all labeled domestic violence in relationships? And those are child abuse, cultural abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, intellectual abuse, pets and property, physical, psychological, sexual, social, spiritual, and verbal. Domestic violence is the second leading cause of death for African American women in the United States. Domestic violence is the third leading cause of death among Native and Indigenous women in the United States, and it is the seventh leading cause of death among Caucasian women. Relational abuse, dating and marriage violence, domestic violence are huge barriers in safe, pure, healthy relationships. They cannot be ignored. If you are experiencing something like this in your relationship, there is help. And I'm going to put the domestic violence hotline on the screen. Moving forward, if these are all barriers to sexual purity, if this is what sexual purity looks not like, then what does sexual purity look like in real life? Well, first of all, sexual purity starts in the mind, because sexual impurity starts in the mind. We don't act out sexually in a physical way unless we have already embraced sexual impurity in the mind first. Pornography addiction is a disease of the mind, an addiction of the mind, not of the veins. It's not like alcohol or cocaine, where you just remove the substance and you get sober. It's held in the mind. Sexual impurity starts in the thoughts. Sexual purity also begins in the thoughts. When we have thoughts, our thoughts produce our feelings. It's like this cycle. Our feelings produce our actions. Our actions repeated create habits. Habits repeated form a character, and your character determines your destiny. But it all starts way back up here at the top with your thoughts. So the very first step to sexual purity is mental. It starts with how you think. What are you filling your mind with? Are you filling your mind with music, entertainment, pornography, any of these other things that do not lead you more towards purity? Are you relaxing with entertainment that glamorizes indignity, that glamorizes indecency, that makes light of the things that God calls pure and holy? If that's what you're feeding your mind on for whatever purpose, entertainment, relaxation, just because you like it, you're going to increase your struggle with sexual purity in your relationships, because your mind is already feeding on a diet of junk food, of sexual impurity. If you are working toward actively making choices that lead you to purity, not control. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of choices that lead you to try to control everyone's purity around you. She needs a longer skirt. She needs a higher neck shirt. She needs to wear longer sleeves. That is not an appropriate color of lipstick. He needs to change his suit. No, stop. You are responsible for yourself and your thoughts before God. That's it. You're not responsible for how anyone else does anything, because the only thing you take to heaven with you is your character and your thoughts. So, our thoughts dictate our feelings and our actions. If we look at another person and we see the face of God in them, if we are looking for the image of God in the people we see around us, we cannot look at them for the purpose of sexual exploitation for our own gratification. It becomes impossible. When we are filling our mind with things of God, we begin to see other people as reflections of Him, whole persons, not just sex parts. So as we are seeking sexual purity in our relationships, the first step is to address our thoughts. What are we feeding our mind on? Then we address our emotions. What are we feeding our emotions on? How are we allowing our hearts to get entwined and bound up and carried away when our feelings run off with us in a way that may or may not be glorifying to God? After that is where we address the physical part, because it's only after that that our thoughts produce our feelings, which produce our actions. And our actions create our habits. And habits are either like rails that keep the train from busting out and wandering all over the field and having a wreck, or they're like chains that bind us and drag us down. Bad habits, habits of impure thinking, habits of impure acting are like chains, binding us up in slavery. But you can break those by choosing to think different, choosing to surrender those things to God for His cleansing and transformation. It may take counseling, therapy, might even take rehab. But those thoughts, once we take those thoughts, Ellen White says that the thoughts and feelings combined make up the moral character. If you want to be a man or a woman of high moral fiber, you get to choose. You have to start by choosing what you put into your mind and choosing who you surround yourself with, not in a controlling way, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that says, this is who I want to be, and this is what I'm willing to do for God. This is where I stand. This is what is important to me. This is what I choose for my life. I choose to separate myself from the influences of the world that encourage and wink, turn a blind eye to exploitation and self-gratification, because those aren't holy, and I want to be holy. I want to be like Jesus. I want Jesus Christ to transform me and make me like him. I want my sexual life to be something that is free of shame, something that is pure and good and true and honest and of good reputation. I want it to be in the right context, in the right place, in the right way, and completely and purely holy and glorifying to God in a way that I don't need to ever feel ashamed of my sexual choices, even in my dating relationships, because I have chosen, regardless of whatever trauma, regardless of whatever past abuse, regardless of whatever addictions I have struggled with, I have chosen to be pursuing the heart of Jesus Christ. I have chosen to be honest, to be transparent, to be pure, to live with one face to the world, not a different internal reality than my external reality, not living in lies, not living in deceit, not living in a compartmentalized reality. Everything is open. Everything is pure and cleansed by Jesus Christ. And when you take that approach to your dating relationships, it can transform the way that you interact with the opposite sex. It can completely revitalize the way that you date, the way that you conduct yourself, the way that you interact with others, and the expectations you have of other people and of who you are. Because your greatest aim is to glorify God in everything you do, from the thoughts all the way down the line.